All right, if I could please have your attention, thank you. What I want to do now is quickly wrap up my discussion of the Guptas and move on to the next themes that we have for this week. We have a complicated set of developments that we're going to have to look at because we're going to have to turn back to the religious picture once again, since what we're going to find is that Buddhism is going to be slowly disappearing from India. We're going to have Islam coming into India, and we're going to have a person who is going to be responsible for what we can describe as a consolidation of Hinduism, right? So we have all of these developments which are taking place simultaneously, but before we get to that, let me just remind you of what I've been talking about. I've been talking to you about the Guptas, and in my concluding remarks last week, I had read out a quotation to you from Fahin, who's a Chinese pilgrim, Chinese traveler who had come to India, and this was a long quotation about the nature of the reign of Chandragupta II, who reigned from 380 to 413, right? Now this period, as I mentioned to you on a number of occasions, is also known as the classical age or the golden age of Indian history. Part of the reason has to do with, obviously, the consolidation of political power under the Guptas, because after the Mauryans, this is the first time that we now have, again, something resembling a pan-Indian empire. But it also has to do with developments which I had enumerated very briefly in science, mathematics, technology, and so on. Now, one of the greatest figures of this period is a playwright by the name of Kalidasa. We don't really have the time, unfortunately, to look into his writings. He is one of the 9 Navratna. Navratna is a Sanskrit for 9 jewels of Chandragupta II's court. So he's supposed to have amassed 9 great poets who were members of his court. And Kalidasa is usually reckoned to be the greatest, by far the greatest of these 9 poets. A person whose influence on Indian literature is going to be tremendous. And in fact, he's going to be influential in a certain way in the development of late 18th, early 19th century European literature as well. Because if you turn to somebody like Goethe in Faust, the whole idea of the proscenium, the particular way in which you develop the theater, the stage of the theater, this is something that in fact actually comes from Kalidasa. He's going to be translated into English in the late 18th century. Now, there are a number of works that are attributed to him. The most famous of these is a work called Shakunthala. I'm not going to write these names because you're going to find them in all the histories. Shakunthala, which is a play which essentially revolves around the life of a king who is going to have a memory lapse, if I may put it this way, and is going to forget the woman that he's married to, his queen, but then they're going to be reunited at the very end. So it's a sort of a romance. But what is interesting is, of course, the particular language that he uses, the elegance of Sanskrit that he uses. And it is important to mention at this juncture that if you look at Sanskrit, now Sanskrit, as I mentioned to you, was the language in which, in fact, actually some of the inscriptions by Samudragupta, for example, the great inscription which I discussed at some length, which is found in Allahabad, which he had, in fact, left on an Ashokan pillar, partly to signify the fact that he was now claiming the Mauryan political legitimacy as his own, right? You might recall that particular discussion I'd had, and I'd mentioned that this inscription that had been left on this rock pillar, Ashokan pillar, was in fact in Sanskrit. But Sanskrit is a language that now spreads into Southeast Asia, and it is an extremely elegant language, but it had also become highly formulaic. It had also become extremely complex. To give you an illustration of what I mean when I say it had become complex, so if you look at this word Mahatma, I'm taking a common word which you will encounter later on when we start looking in the last week or perhaps in the 9th week at Mahatma Gandhi. So the word Mahatma is in fact a Sanskrit word, compound word made up of 2 words, Maha, which means great, and Atma. So the A here becomes a long A because it combines with the A of the first word and the A of the second word, right? And Atma means soul, so great soul. So that's a compound word. Now you've got Sanskrit compound words which are going to be made up of 20 compounds, right? So try to figure out what the word is. You have to know the meaning of each of these compounds and how the word in fact is broken up. there are going to be sentences. In fact, in Samudragupta's own inscription, sentences, a single sentence running into several pages. So the language has become highly complex, it's become highly formulaic, and one of the reasons that Kalidasa is going to be prized is because he's going to again try to show the elegance of Sanskrit, but without that kind of formulaic tendencies that Sanskrit had slipped into by this point of time. All right? And Shakunthala is his most famous work, but you have a whole number of other works. You have a work called Raghuvamsa, which is a chronicle of the kings of Raghu, which is the line of Ram, supposedly the solar line, right? Meghadoot, which is translated into English as the cloud messenger, where the cloud essentially is the subject of the poem, right? The cloud is moving over the king's terrains and is seeing everything and is then giving you a description in part of the city, right? And so on. So these are some of the kinds of works. I mean, he's writing mainly in verse, and his approximate dates are sometime in the early 5th century, right? Sometime in the early 5th century, those are the approximate dates. There's been quite a lot of uncertainty about exactly when he lived, and in fact, there used to be a supposition that he actually belonged to the 1st century AD, but now I think the more reasonable conclusion is that he lived somewhere in the 5th century. Now, Chandragupta II's period is also known for the fact that the Puranas, right? So these Hindu myths that you read, you read short excerpts of these Hindu myths, and I've mentioned to you such works as the Vishnu Purana, although there are many other Puranas. The word Purana itself means old, okay, and there's a Shiva Purana, the Linga Purana, so forth and so on. Now, these Puranas take their final form sometime in the 5th century, right? Sometime during the reign of Chandragupta II, right? So this is one of the many reasons why this age is considered, as I said, the golden or classical age, because of developments in literature, the political consolidation of the empire, right? The patronage extended to scientists, mathematicians, astronomers, and so on, right? Now, the fag end of the Guptas is going to be a time when India is going to be attacked by the Huns. The Huns again are coming from the northwest, and I'm sure many of you have heard of Attila the Hun. Well, that's what we're speaking of. We're speaking of the Huns, so we're going to have a constant series of invasions. Many of them are going to be repulsed by the successors of Samudragupta. But one of the consequences of these invasions is the weakening of the empire, and by roughly 550, we can say that the Guptas have pretty much disappeared from the scene. Okay, I mean, the last great Hun attacks are going to take place around 495 to 515, right? And you're not really going to have the Huns ruling over India, but as I said, the consequence of these attacks is the fact that the Gupta Empire is now starting to weaken considerably, right? And you have to keep in mind something that I mentioned to you about the Raj Mandala. I just want to remind you one last time about this political configuration called the Raj Mandala, because this is going to be the nature of medieval kingdoms. They are going to replicate this particular, political stratagem, if I may put it this way. And the Raj Mandala, as I said, was that what you have is you have a core kingdom here, then you have a core around that, which is a zone of people who are not particularly friendly to you, right? But they're not in the position to attack your core kingdom. And then you have another core around that, okay? And you're going to have another circle around that, and so on. And the way to think about it is that, so if this is the kingdom, the central empire, and then you have this zone over here, and then you have the second zone. So this is the first zone, second zone, third zone, perhaps a fourth zone over here, right? One way to think about it is that the people in zone 1 are your enemies, the people in zone 2 are your friends. Your enemy's enemy is your friend, okay? And so this person is being encircled both by the core kingdom and by zone 2, but the people in zone 1 are likely to forge an alliance with people in zone 3, right? So it's a layer of enemies and friends, and your enemy's enemy, as I said, is your friend. This is one of the ways in which you forge these political alliances, right? And one of the problems that the Guptas are facing here, now is that the attacks are coming from the northwest. They come, and the attacks usually will impact the extremities of the empire first. So when an empire begins to dissolve, usually it is going to be the places which are at the extremes which are going to dissolve first. And that will allow further penetration into the kingdom, right, by the enemy. Right? And this is, in a sense, what the Huns are doing. Okay? So they're gradually encroaching upon the Guptas over a period of several decades with repeated incursions, and one of the consequences, as I said, the most fatal consequence was the Guptas are eventually going to be eviscerated. All right? So this is where we pretty much end with the Guptas, is in the middle of the 6th century. Now, the development I want to alert you to before we move to the question of religion is India's relations with Southeast Asia. Okay? Now, in principle, it's not really a part of the history of India. That is what is happening in, the various places in what is today called Southeast Asia, which would include the Malay archipelago, the Indonesian archipelago, Vietnam, Cambodia, right? All of that. I mean, if you were doing the history of Southeast Asia, you would really have to obviously look at that. Think of the fact that that the old name of Vietnam is Indochina. Right? Now that tells you a little bit about how you might begin to think about this area and what is its relationship to India. And we're not going to spend too much time on that because, as I said, it doesn't properly belong within the history of India, but in some sense it does. I mean, if you were, let's take a comparable example, if you were a historian of Britain in the 19th century, right, and you didn't look at all at what Britain was doing in India and the empire it had acquired in the 19th century, it would be a very strange kind of history that you would end up with, of Britain in the 19th century. Of course, the majority of the historians of Britain do exactly that. They don't bother looking at India at all, because India is somewhere out there, right? But Britain became a great colonial power in the late 18th, 19th century. And so we would have to look at, obviously, what Britain was doing in its colonies. Now, India cannot be spoken of as having a political empire, okay, a political empire in this part of the world, not an empire in the sense in which Britain or France had an empire in the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, right? But I want to give you, just to give you a sense of why this is important and then give you some of the details, I want to just read out one paragraph from this book by Kulke and Rothermund, A History of India. And I've taken the opinion here of two German historians who have spent a lifetime studying India rather than taking an Indian historian, just to see what their assessment is of the relationship of India to Southeast Asia. So I'm reading from page 143. That transmission, they say, of Indian culture to distant parts of Central Asia, China, Japan, and especially Southeast Asia is one of the greatest achievements of Indian history, or even of the history of mankind. None of the other great civilizations, not even the Hellenic, had been able to achieve a similar success without military conquest. Okay? Now that gives you some clues as to why this is obviously important, because beginning in the 1st century, in the upper reaches of the Mekong Delta, okay, when present-day Vietnam, there's going to be a kingdom that's going to develop by the name of Funan. And its origins are certainly Indian, beginning in the 1st century. And we're going to find that certainly until the 14th century, so for a period well over 1,000 years, there is going to be a substantial Indian presence. I mean, the scholars usually speak of the Indianized kingdoms or the Indianized states of Southeast Asia. That's one of the ways in which the literature has been described. But the literature has gone through several revolutionary turns, which I'm going to describe very briefly, because we want to make sure that we don't make the same Orientalist mistake now, right, when we start looking at India's relationships to Southeast Asia and assume, as Britain did, when Britain's assumption was that India really had nothing to offer, that what had, at this point in time, in the 18th century, that it might have been a great, glorious civilization, but then by the 18th century it has fallen into a state of absolute disrepair, right? So the assumption is that the British are bringing enlightenment, rationality, so forth and so on. Now, I think many Indian scholars made a similar assumption with respect to Southeast Asia, but they were prompted by European scholarship, because it's European scholarship which first started looking seriously at the relationship of India to Southeast Asia. So they used the template of how you would understand India to now understand India's own relations with Southeast Asia. Okay? So that's the first caveat you have to keep in mind. What is a kind of template that we're going to use? Now, the second consideration for us is exactly how did the Indians start making their presence felt in Southeast Asia? Now, you had essentially three theories about that. The first theory has been shot to pieces. No serious scholar actually looks at it anymore, but it's still worth mentioning, and it's called the Kshatriya Theory. Right? So you have to now go to the Varnas. So remember the Varna system. So you have the Kshatriyas, the Brahmins, and all of those. Right? So the three theories are each named after the three castes at the top: the Brahmins, Kshatriyas, and the Vaishyas. Okay? And the Kshatriya theory, which is the first theory that emerges, is a theory that emerges really in early 20th century India, when Indian nationalism is becoming important. Now, India has, of course, been under colonial rule for a substantial period of time. And there is a huge level of embarrassment about the fact that India is being, on the one hand, India obviously has some kind of cultural empire, and that's the phrase that I think we ought to use, that India had some kind of cultural empire, because remember the Kulke quotation, which is, and there's general agreement about that this is not an empire that was acquired by the use of military conquest. Okay? So if it was not acquired by military conquest, then exactly how did Indian influence become so pervasive? Okay? And it is very, very pervasive. If you go to, for example, Angkor, I mean, the most well-known sign of that pervasiveness, of course, is Angkor Wat, which is a complex that is a Hindu complex, right? And I think all of you have probably heard of it, one of the greatest temple complexes in the world, right? And this complex develops over a period of 200 to 300 years in present-day Cambodia, right? Or you can go to Burma, portions of Burma, Pagan, constructed 1044. The construction goes on till 1276. Third illustration, Borubodor, a great Buddhist site in Java, early 9th century, okay, reflecting entirely the features of Indian art and architecture. And then in close proximity to that is a temple complex called Prambanan, 10th century. So this is central Java, not too far from Yogyakarta, about 18-20 miles from Yogyakarta, but again within Java. Four illustrations of the pervasiveness of Indian culture leading to these stupendous temple complexes that I've just described to you very briefly. Okay? So the question now is, how did Indian influence become so pervasive? How was Hinduism actually carried to these parts? And how pervasive was Hinduism, right, in Southeast Asia as a whole? Right? So the first theory is the Kshatriya theory, that Indian warriors or people of the Kshatriya caste went over and colonized, okay, Southeast Asia. But there really isn't any real evidence for that. You know, and the whole endeavor of the theory was to show that Indians could be martial too. We could have masculinity as well. We had a military past. Right? This is why this theory becomes important in the early 20th century, because Indian nationalists are trying to suggest that, well, Indians are not just people who are constantly subjugated by others, that we had the ability to carry out conquest too. Right? I mean, it's a strange argument. Why do you want to take credit for a military conquest? But that's the nature of the times. Okay? This theory, as I said, is pretty much shot down. Then you have the two dominant theories. One is the Vaishya theory or the trader theory. In other words, Hinduism was largely carried over to Southeast Asia by Indian traders. Right? Now, there's some plausibility in that hypothesis. Some, not very much. Why not very much? Well, most of the traders who went, they would have settled down. Okay, and one thing you have to keep in mind, right, very important little detail, that the nature of these movements migrations, travels. Okay? You cannot compare it to modern day businessmen, sitting on a 747, okay, hopping over to Paris for a business deal and flying back the next day. You are going by boat, and your movements are affected by the monsoon. The monsoon, exceedingly important. All of India and Southeast Asia is heavily impacted by the monsoon. Now, when the heavy monsoon rains come, you might not be able to move at all for 2 months. So what we are seeing is something very significant, namely that the nature of cosmopolitanism at that time was very different. In fact, it might have been much more genuinely cosmopolitan, because unlike today's businessman or today's consumer, right? Now you might, in your evening, you open the yellow pages and you say, I can have Greek, Chinese, Italian, I wonder which one I should get for a takeout. And you think you're cosmopolitan. But that doesn't make you cosmopolitan. That simply makes you a consumer of a certain kind. Now that cosmopolitanism meant actually something different, because these monsoon winds made it impossible for traders to travel at other times. And sometimes when you traveled, and the monsoon might be unpredictable, you might actually just live in that area that you've traveled to for months. And then you might begin to marry women from that area. Okay, there's settlements that are going to develop. Right? But there's a little problem with the trader's hypothesis. One problem is that you would then expect that these kingdoms and settlements, right, that we're speaking about in Southeast Asia, these would be mainly in the coastal region. Well, unfortunately, that's not the case. They're actually mainly in the mountainous or interior regions, where the penetration of the traders was actually very little. Very little. The other interesting thing is that all of these Southeast Asian languages, Indonesian is a fantastic example. In fact, it's called Bhasha Indonesia. That's the official word. Right? Bhasha itself is a Sanskrit word, which means language. Okay? And Indonesia, by the way, is a term which was really given by the Europeans, which means the Indian islands. Greater India. That's what Indonesia means. Okay? Now, these languages have a large number of loan words. Sanskrit, in Bhasha Indonesia has thousands of loan words. The daughter of one of the great figures in Indonesian political history is a woman by the name of Sukarno Putri. Putri, P-U-T-R-I. Putri is a Sanskrit for daughter. Okay? I could give you thousands of. Their airline is called Garuda, which is the name of an Indian god. Okay? Hindu god. So forth and so on. Now these loan words are all really from Sanskrit. But the traders were not using Sanskrit. They were not using Sanskrit. They were using their vernacular languages. And as you go on into the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 6th, 7th centuries, because then there's going to be extensive contact between South India, between the Cholas over here. Okay? And they would have been using Tamil. They would have been using Tamil. But you don't find loan words from Tamil, really, in these languages in Southeast Asia. So there are some problems with the trader's hypothesis. Now that leaves us with the third hypothesis, and that is the Brahmin hypothesis, that the people who really carried Hinduism to Southeast Asia were the Brahmins. All right? But there are some issues over there. And those issues have to do with to what extent can we say that these Indianized states are called Indianized states because the courts adopted, okay, the royal insignia, the way of the courts of India. They borrowed from Indian courts. To what extent was that the case, and to what extent was it the case that common people actually adopted Hinduism, for example? Now there seems to be much less evidence for that. And the fact that all of these temple complexes that I am describing are all very magisterial suggests also substantial patronage, okay, by the kings, by the courts. And the hypothesis here really is that what happened, And I think that this is probably largely closer to the truth. We won't know for sure, but I think this is a better approximation of trying to understand that history, is that essentially these Southeast Asian kingdoms had a kind of a indigenous development of their own. Now, as they develop, they find that they need artha and dharma, that is, they need some kind of law codes, they need governance manuals, if I may put it this way, some codes of governance. This is highly developed in India, as you know, from everything that I've said to you in the last 5 weeks. There's a whole class of literature on the Artha Shastras, the Dharma Shastras. So the likelihood is that the courts were eager to bring in these Brahmins, who basically would then carry out the sacrifices, hold the rituals, advise the Southeast Asian, okay, I'm using the word Southeast Asian. Southeast Asia is again a geopolitical category of the post-World War II period. Okay, but I'm using it as a sake of convenience to refer to the Khmer, okay, to the Champa kingdom in the southern part of Vietnam, right? Java, in the entire Indonesian archipelago, all of that, right? So that these Southeast Asian kingdoms, essentially what they did was they basically invited the Brahmins, who then helped them become more effective rulers, right? This is the more likely hypothesis. Now, there used to be an old theory, which I'm not sure that I really would go by. I mean, I myself was quite persuaded by it many years ago, but I think that now the literature is suggesting something different. So if you go back for a second, since I'm going to wrap up my discussion of this now, if you go back for a second to the word Indochina, okay, I mean, generally the way people have looked at Southeast Asia is to suggest that there are two great civilizational influences, right, which impinged upon the development of Southeast Asia. One was the Indic, the other was the Sinic. So India and China. And the general view used to be that perhaps that Southeast Asia derived its politics, its political structures from China, and it derived its religion and its cultural structures from India. Right? So if you look, for example, as an illustration, if you look at present-day Indonesia, and I think I've mentioned this in a different context on a previous occasion, right? If you look at present-day Indonesia, overwhelmingly Muslim, overwhelmingly, right? Java is 99% Muslim, okay, close to that, okay. But if you look at their wayang kulit is their puppet theater, right? Okay, puppetry. If you look at their epics, if you look at their dance dramas, right, the stories are all drawn from the Puranic literature of India, from the Mahabharata, the Ramayana. There's been a massive transmission of the Ramayana. Each one of these places in Southeast Asia, almost without exception, has its own version of the Ramayana story. And this is the best illustration of the transmission of Indian culture. Okay? So as I said, the old theory was that these places got their culture and religions from India. They got their political structures from, in fact, China. But I'm not so certain of that anymore, because I think that now when we begin to understand, how actually these Indians came to Southeast Asia, how these kingdoms became, so to speak, Indianized, I think we have to understand that, in fact, actually the Brahmins had a great deal to do with creating the royal houses, if I may put it this way, that you find in Southeast Asia. Right? That is, in providing legitimacy in the realm of governance, law codes, so forth and so on. So that there might have been a substantial influence in that respect as well. Okay, but this is roughly the outline. So we are saying, from the 1st century until about the 14th or 15th century, and in fact, in some ways, the history of India falling under colonial rule is going to be the same history that Southeast Asia is going to face, right, around the same period of time. The Dutch East Indies companies is going to become highly influential in Southeast Asia, right? Right, so this is what we're really speaking about over here, is for 1300, maybe 1400 years, we're speaking a substantial influence of India in this part of the world. Right? And I'm not going to be able to take up this story again. because they're of course extraordinarily interesting chapters of it, right? Particularly the relationships, the very close relationships that are going to develop between South India and Southeast Asia. Now, having put that aside, let me turn my attention to the question of the history of India now from, let's say, 600 AD onwards, okay? And what's happening in India. And the first question that I think we're going to turn to is the question of how do we begin to assess the presence of three religions now, okay? And here I'm excluding for a moment Jainism, okay? Sikhism hasn't come around at this point in time. That's going to be a later development, okay? And you've got a Christian presence in South India, but it's not an overwhelming presence. We're going to have to wait until the Europeans come into India before the Christian chapters of Indian history begin to be written once again, right? Especially beginning with the Portuguese. At this point in time, what we're speaking about is that Buddhism has been prevalent in North India for a substantial period of time, okay? And it has a presence throughout the Gangetic Plains. It has also spread to other parts, right, of Southeast Asia, portions of China, Japan, right? Remember, beginning with Ashoka's time himself. Ashoka himself had sent emissaries, including members of his own family, right? So that's one thing that you bear in mind, is the presence of Buddhism. The new factor is going to be the coming of Islam, right? And we're going to have to see what's happening within Hinduism itself. So let me first turn my attention, and I'm going to continue this lecture on Wednesday because I'm not going to be able to finish everything I'm saying today. Let me begin with this question of the disappearance of Buddhism from India, right? Which is a complex question, very complex question. Why exactly did Buddhism disappear from the land of its birth? And we know that this is beginning to happen sometime around the 5th, 6th century. We have another Chinese traveler, okay? So he's coming 2 centuries after Fa Hin, right? He's coming 2 centuries after Fa Hin. He's coming to India in the roughly in the early 7th century, and circa 600, okay? And he's going to spend about 10-15 years in India, right? A substantial period of time. And he's going to visit most of the great Buddhist sites, most of the sites associated with Buddhism. So that will include Kushinagar, Kapilavastu, and he's going to go to Patna or Patliputra, right? That entire Gangetic belt, and going to leave behind a very detailed record. Now we have another source as well, by the way, for this time, and this is a source called this is a source by Bana. Bana is a playwright, and he writes a book called the Harsha Charita. So I just need to spend a couple of minutes on him first before I go back to the question of the disappearance of Buddhism, right? Harshvardhan is a figure who is going to develop an empire in North India, okay? Strictly in North India. I mean, some people allege that the empire extended. You know, Indian nationalist historians in the early part of the 20th century like to think of him as having essentially taken over from where the Guptas had left off, because Harsha's years of reign are approximately 606 to 645, 648, something like that. Okay, so he's got a long reign, and he's going to have an empire in North India, right? An important political figure, because this is again an attempt to consolidate the political history of India, but he's not going to be able to really extend down into the Deccan at all, not even remotely. Okay? But there are 2 sources for his time. One of them is a source by Bana, who's a playwright, and he writes a book called the Harsha Charita, which is a biography. Charitra has been picture, okay? The picture of his life, right? It's a biography of him. And the other source that we have is this travel record by Hyun Chang. All right? That's the other source that we have. So we've got these 2 main sources for this early part of the 7th century. Bana doesn't really tell us very much about what else is going on. He tells us more about what is going on in the court of Harsha. Harshvardhan is the other formal name by which he is known. Right? And as I said, he is important only because, frankly, he is able to consolidate this empire, and the way he's able to do it, you recall what I mentioned to you, that the Guptas have been completely now, in a sense, weakened by these repeated Hun invasions, and Harsha is going to be able to repel the Huns, right, which these Hun invasions go on for a substantial period of time. He's going to be able to repel invaders coming in again from the northwest and establish a kingdom, the center of which is Kannauj, and Kannauj is halfway between Delhi and Patna in the Gangetic Plains. All right? And that's more or less all you need to know about him at the present moment. Now, in the early 7th century, our Chinese traveler gives us a fairly detailed sense of what is going on, okay, in these Buddhist sites. So he finds that, for example, if you go to the major Buddhist sites, all right, you find a lot of Buddhists, but they are being outnumbered by the Hindus, substantially outnumbered. Right, so in Banaras, or Varanasi as its formal name is, he finds that there are 3,000 Buddhist monks, but there are more than 10,000 non-Buddhists. These are figures that he gives, right? And what he's trying to suggest is that a people who were once dominant are slowly being eclipsed by the Hindus. And part of the reason may have been that the Guptas, as I said, had given patronage to Hinduism. Okay, so the great empire of the Guptas was an empire which had slowly once again taken India towards what is going to become Hinduism. Right? But there may be lots of other reasons for the decline of Hinduism, and the historians have generally grouped these reasons into 3 categories. So one is what you could describe as a sectarian and internal histories, right? Sectarian internal histories. These histories focus on schisms or conflicts within the Buddhist faith, the widening gap between the clergy, the monks, and the common people. 3 categories that we have to think about, right? This because Buddhism has monastic orders, as we had seen. So there's a widening gap between the laity, that is the common people, the clergy, and the monks, right? And these internal and sectarian histories also focus on the growing corruption within the Sangha. Sangha is a community, right? Now you have a second class of histories which focus essentially on Buddhism's relations with Brahminism. You can call it Hinduism if you want. Brahminism is a better word, because the question is, what was a particular relationship that the Buddhists had with the Brahmins? All right. You recall, for example, that among Vishnu's incarnations is the Buddha. Right. Now, was this a Brahminical strategy, right, to absorb the Buddha into the Hindu fold? Right. These are the sorts of things that we're hinting at. And we're going to talk about it a little bit more in greater detail, but I'm just giving you the broad outline over here. And these histories focus on the persecution, alleged or real, of Buddhists by Brahmins, the defeat of the Buddhists by the great theologian Shankaracharya. I'm going to turn to him in a moment. Right? The defeat of the Buddhists by Shankaracharya in debates. Right? And Shankaracharya lives, his dates are 788 to 820. Right? But this history that I'm giving you is a history of the decline of Buddhism, which begins earlier on and will go on for several centuries until Buddhism will eventually disappear. So it's a history that extends over several centuries. And Shankaracharya falls in the middle of this period. And according to this narrative, he is supposed to have, put the finishing touch to this, to the end of Buddhism in India, right? Because he's supposed to have engaged the Buddhists in public debates and defeated the Buddhists, right? So these histories, which focus on Buddhism's relations with Brahminism, as I said, focus on the persecution, alleged or real, of Buddhists by Brahmins, the defeat of the Buddhists by Shankaracharya in debate, and the characteristic tendency of Brahminism to absorb features from other religions. right? And then you finally have a third set of histories which give a different explanation for why Buddhism disappeared from the land of its birth. I call these secular and political histories, which largely emphasize the withdrawal of royal patronage from Buddhism, and finally, the Muslim invasions into India. Right? So we've got 7 or 8 reasons here that have been advanced, which I've grouped under 3 categories, very broadly speaking. And it's not obviously possible for me to dwell on all of these 7 or 8 at great length, but I'm just giving you an idea. Let me turn my attention here to Shankaracharya, all right, because this will enable us to enter into this debate through one personality, and at the same time, we'll see that there are a number of reasons which are evident in the life of Shankaracharya himself, which point to why Buddhism may have disappeared. So Shankaracharya is born in 788. Some people would describe him as the most important figure in the history of Hinduism. The most important figure. Okay? Who is he? He's a Nambudri Brahmin. So he's a Brahmin who comes from the present-day state of Kerala. Okay? His birthplace, in fact, is only a few kilometers from Cochin. Okay? Born into a Brahmin family, and supposedly becomes extremely learned. He becomes extremely learned by the age of 7 or 8. You know, has an absolute command of all the 4 Vedas by the time that he's 8 years old. Now, we're not really interested in this sort of hagiography, okay, whether in fact he had mastered this or that or not by a certain age. What is certainly very clear is that his writings become highly influential. And his writings, in fact, consist largely of commentaries. Commentaries principally on the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Brahma Sutras. And I want to refresh your memory about something I had said on previous occasions, that very often when one reads these texts, one reads them with a commentary by somebody. Right? So Shankaracharya's gloss or commentary is supposedly the most important commentary that we have on these texts, on the Gita, the Upanishads, and the Brahma Sutras. Right? And to appreciate what he is doing, what we have to think of is the following. He is, in effect, reviving Advaita Vedanta. Okay, so Advaita Vedanta is the philosophy of the Upanishads. I'm just going to write these words down for you. So Vedanta incidentally is the primary name by which Indian philosophy becomes known in the West in the late 19th century, 20th century, and down to our times. So most of what is known as Indian philosophy in the West particularly is really Vedanta. Vedanta is a compound word again, Veda and Anta, the end of the Vedas, right? And Advaita, the A is a Sanskrit prefix which is a negation, as in the word ahimsa. Right? Recall this word from my discussion of Buddhism and Jainism. So himsa is violence, ahimsa is non-violence, right? Dvaita means dualism, okay? And Advaita means non-dualism or monism, right? And now you have to take your mind back to the Upanishads, because remember the teachings of the Upanishads, right? That the Atman and the Brahman are the same. Avidya is ignorance, non-knowledge, is when we think of them as separate. So our task is to gain knowledge, gyan, knowledge, and this knowledge makes us realize that Atman and Brahman are the same. When we know that Atman and Brahman are the same, we achieve emancipation, moksha, right? One of the great ends. We achieve moksha. Right? That's the teaching of the Upanishads. Now, what he is going to do is he is going to crystallize this teaching once again after a period of something like 1,000 years, 1,400 years, right? I mean, the earliest Upanishads go back to the 8th century BCE. We're now talking about 800 AD here, 788 to 820. 15 centuries have elapsed. A great deal of water has flowed under the bridge by this point in time, right? But his teachings here are very similar. Something I pointed out before when I was discussing the Upanishads. Very similar to the teachings of the Buddha, right? Very similar to the teachings of the Buddha. In fact, one of the things that Shankaracharya is going to say is that you attain liberation or emancipation, freedom, from this cycle of rebirths into which you're going to fall constantly. You only attain that when you come to the realization, right, that the Atman and the Brahman are one and the same. Now, the precise metaphysics of the Buddha might be a little bit different. That's not the point. The point here is that what Shankaracharya has done, he has taken one of the great teachings of the Buddhists as well, and essentially put it into the fold of Hinduism. Right? That is given less reason for Buddhism to exist as a separate religion. Because the Buddha is also saying that the way that we escape the cycle of rebirths is we come to a certain kind of self-realization. Right? Self-realization. And so Shankaracharya is saying pretty much the same thing, but he's saying it at a time, and this is a difference between what he's saying and what was said at the time of the Upanishads. He's saying it at a time when Buddhism is still very much around, even though it's slowly falling into decline. Slowly falling into decline. Right? Now, at the same time, what Shankaracharya will do, my last comment, and then you can go. At the same time, what Shankaracharya is doing is that he is suggesting that there are those, and this goes back to the teachings of the Gita, there are those who still will hold to the idea that there is a personal God, a personal creator. Because remember that under the teachings of the Upanishads, there is no conception of a personal God, a personal deity, right? A creator in this sense, a personal creator. Shankaracharya will hold on to that idea as well, because this is one way to bring in the masses. And so what we are saying is that Shankaracharya's great role is really the following: that he is going to try to effect a philosophical synthesis of Hinduism, accommodating the high and the low. The high would be the teachings of the Upanishads, the low would be those teachings of the Gita which in fact dwell on dualism, that there is a personal God out there, a personal creator, and you can worship that personal creator. Right? This is the philosophical synthesis he's going to effect between the Brahminical strand or the high strand of Hinduism and the popular strand of Hinduism. And it's his attempt to, in a sense, forge a universal synthesis of Hinduism which is going to become the dominant mode under which Hinduism is going to be known henceforth. All right, we're going to stop over here. I'm going to continue with him and also start looking at the coming of Islam to India.